Book notes, tonight at 8 o'clock Eastern and Pacific on C-SPAN.
Washington Journal continues.
Christopher Hitchens, contributing editor to Vanity Fair. Good morning. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning.
And Georgie and Geyer, syndicated columnist, just back from Kosovo. Why were you there and what did you see?
Well, you know, Steve, I think one of the sins of us in the press is that we forget stories. You remember 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Kosovo, Sarajevo, Serbia, the Balkans were big stories. We invested. Yeah. We had a war there in the spring of '99, and now no one covers them. You know, we get one story. We tend to do one story to the exclusion of everything else in the world. So I thought, gee, let's go to Kosovo and let's go to Sarajevo and see what's happened. After all, these were the first UN, big UN missions and mandates. And the fact that they didn't work for so long, I think, I know, has lessons for us in Iraq. And that's why I went.
And that was my first question to you, because you quote President Clinton, who was there, saying, I'm quite aware of where you want to go. I believe in self-determination. I want to see you free. The only question is how you do it. What does Kosovo and Iraq have in common?
That's the question, is how do you do it in either place? I've not always been an admirer of President Clinton, but I have to tell you, Steve, that day he spoke in Kosovo at the university, and he was superb. I mean, people were crying. Because they do feel that he saved them from the Serb aggression, and in many ways he did. Now, what do you have to do? He's saying they should have independence, which is what many people feel. But they're all tied up because they belong to Serbia. The UN doesn't want to act. The United States doesn't want to act now because of Iraq. So in both places, you have questions of nation building, you have questions of untying these historic knots. They're all just tied up like this, and now tied up with the UN and with their own governments and with Serbia. And many of those same questions are in Iraq.
Christopher Hitchens, in a vivid description about your visit to Iraq, you say, don't bother visiting Baghdad today if you are too easily upset by contradictions. Irony and negation are the everyday currencies. Iraq is a place, and Iraq as a country is a special territory of archaeologists. And then you go on to talk about Saddam's morbid mania for burying things and people. Can you elaborate?
I think it's on the next page. There's a picture of about 36 warplanes, Iraqi warplanes, that were found buried in the desert near an airport outside Baghdad. They bury everything. They buried huge amounts of money, for example. Usually the currency that belonged to the Iraqi people was stolen from the national treasury to the tune of billions of dollars, American dollars in cash, gold. Some of this has been retrieved, some of it's being used to finance this campaign of murder and intimidation. But to bury a warplane is sort of crazy. I mean, it's never going to fly again if it's been buried in the sand. What are they doing? That's where I think, by the way, some of the traces of their weapons program will eventually be found. They have this mania for interment, but the worst of that is the burial of people.
So you think they have weapons?
Oh, I don't have any doubt about it, no. I don't think they had them. We know they had them because they declared them. They just never declared what they'd done with them. I imagine that some of these weapons are buried under the sand. The ghastly thing, the really terrible thing, is that we're still digging them up, are the mass graves. I went to the site in Hilla in southern Iraq, where they're still finding more and more mounds of people. It's estimated that there might be as many as 300,000 missing Iraqis to be found in that way. They unearth a mass grave almost every single day. And that's the other measure of what kind of a regime we were facing then and the remnants of which we're still facing now. Do you mind if I make a small correction to what Georgianne just said? Because I agree with her that one shouldn't forget Kosovo and Bosnia. Indeed, it was there, in my opinion, that American foreign policy changed and where we had to take into account the concept of humanitarian intervention. And actually what it is this week is the anniversary of the massacre at Srebrenica, which is the worst bloodletting in Europe since the Second World War.
How many died there?
About 7,000 men. They took all the men out of the village and just executed them.
At least 7,000 is right.
Least, yeah.
And I just wanted to make a small correction, which is this. You said that the problem constitutionally with Kosovo is it's part of Serbia. Well, the Serbians may want to claim that, but it's never been internationally recognized as part of Serbia. Kosovo recognized as part of Yugoslavia and governed within old Yugoslavia as a Serbian area, but it was not internationally recognized except as part of the Federation of Yugoslavia. And now that the federation ceases to exist, Serbia has no claim on it at all and ran it as a colony. much resented and hated. And whatever happens, they're not going to go back to Serbian rule.
Well, but that is the official setup is that they are still part of Serbia.
Well,
that's why they can't move.
There is still just a remnant of Yugoslavia.
Yeah, it's a remnant.
In the relationship between Serbia and Montenegro. It's the only other member of the former federation that hasn't defected. But I'll repeat, international treaties never recognized Kosovo as part of Serbia proper. Important, I think, because it was the mad scheme for a greater Serbia, accompanied by ethnic cleansing, that necessitated the intervention in the first place. And I also agree with you, I'm not a fan of President Clinton, but I think he and Tony Blair did extremely well there.
Finally.
And actually Blair had to push Clinton into it in many ways. And this again is the foundation of an alliance that I think has done such a fantastic job in Iraq.
Our phone lines are open. We'll get to your calls momentarily. As you well know, General Wesley Clark has talked about what he calls his success in Kosovo as one of the reasons why he should be elected president. What's your sense of Wesley Clark, his military background, his success, if it was a success in Kosovo, and his candidacy today?
Well, I know him quite well, actually. I knew him when he was head of the Southern Command in Panama. And I'm a great admirer of General Clark's. I think he, and his wife too, is a wonderful woman. He really carried that through, greatly respected within NATO. I was talking to some of the NATO people in Sarajevo the other day, and they said, every day when he would get up on the screen during that war, and he really pushed it because Washington didn't want to go along with it. On the other hand, there's a kind of ambivalence about Wes Clark. Like he said the other day, and I think he's fabulous, and I think he'd be a great president or vice president. But he did say the other day on the record that he would have voted for the Iraq War, and then the next day he said, "Oh no, he wouldn't. It was by he would have voted for a resolution to take it to the UN." And I'm afraid you're going to see some of that with Wes Clark. But that doesn't negate all the other terrific things. He's a real new balance of factors within the Democratic Party.
Christopher Hitchens, let me read you what Wesley Clark said in New Hampshire yesterday and get your response. In a democracy, we're founded on dialogue. We're founded on discussion. We're founded on disagreement and even dissension. And it's not wrong. It's the highest form of patriotism to speak out and let your voices be heard across the land. The headline says dissension is a high form of patriotism. Wesley Clark.
He doesn't give one much to disagree with there, does he?
Did you want to respond to Georgie and Geyer?
Well, yes, since you know so much about this, and I'm just becoming Clark conscious myself, so I'm trying to make up my mind. How come he gets photographed with General Mladic, exchanging hats and embraces? With a wanted war criminal and psychopathic murderer?
I criticized that at the time when I saw it, because I was covering the Balkans a lot all over during the 90s. And I really, having seen what he did later, Christopher, I can't be too critical. There was such a difficult time, and all of the European militaries were slobbering up to the Serbs. I mean, it was really appalling.
I know, but you see,
he shouldn't have done it.
No, but what preoccupies me is this: he was apparently told repeatedly before by superior officers, "Don't do that. Don't be fooling around with Mladic. You know what?"
But they all were.
We think of him. So
they all were.
It may not be a matter of insubordination, but it's not. It wasn't an unlucky accident. It wasn't Mladic grabbing a shot. I mean, Clark permitted it to happen. And the same thing about Iraq. It seems to be absolutely unbelievable that someone would not by now know what their view of the Iraq War was.
That set me off the other day. That made me a little nervous.
In a general. I mean, okay, lots of people don't know anything about Iraq. Or perhaps haven't made up their minds. Perhaps I'm wrong that everybody.
But he's a general.
But in order to be a general, let alone a candidate for the presidency, I think you should probably know what your position on the Iraq War had been.
That's why I brought that up. Yeah. And then the next day he said, no, he didn't mean that. And gee.
Yeah, yes, and then to find out he didn't know even then what it was. It's bizarre.
Geyer's syndicated column appeared this weekend called Kosovo's Challenges. And also Christopher Hitchens, who is out with a Vanity Fair article called Liberating Experience, his visit to Iraq. Let's get to your phone calls. Chicago, good morning.
Yes, I read a book by Hilaire Belloc. It was written in 1936. In it, he says that one of the most famous dates in Western history should be September 11th, 1683, when the Muslims were turned back at the gates of Vienna. And then there was another battle in Belgrade in 1697. I always thought we were fighting the wrong people in Belgrade. The Muslims are the enemy. And if there was no September 11, 2001, both your guests would probably be fighting for Muslim rights in Macedonia.
Mr. Hitchens.
Well, now, I wrote a column a couple of years ago saying that I could at least speculate, I quoted Hilaire Belloc indeed, that September the 11th was picked for that reason, because the defeat of the Muslim Turkish Empire at the gates of Vienna in 1683 was the high point of Muslim expansionism. It's been declining ever since, and the bin Ladenists' dream is to restore the old Ottoman Caliphate. And on the whole, I think they've tried to go for significant dates. I don't know. I've never had any further confirmation. Also, there's some people who say that, in fact, the proper date would be September the 12th. I suppose it would depend on Vienna time and New York time as well, up to a certain point. But anyhow, though it is greatly to the credit, I think, of the United States that it rescued Europe's two major Muslim minorities in Bosnia and Kosovo from massacre, from physical destruction. It's very noticeable that Slobodan Milosevic and his apparently secular National Socialist regime, fascist regime, was actually in close cahoots with that of Saddam Hussein. They traded weapons and intelligence, and they mutually exchanged trainers and so forth. There's a lot of non-sectarianism, oddly enough, among dictators of this kind. Saddam Hussein was perfectly happy to support Milosevic while he was murdering Muslims, though Saddam Hussein liked to pose as a Muslim leader himself. So I think that you, sir, would be aiding and abetting that kind of simple-mindedness if you persisted with the line of thinking that we should have taken a pro-Serbian position in the breakup of Yugoslavia.
As some Democrats have argued, was the war a fraud in Iraq?
The war of fraud in Iraq.
Were we
It was
misled
certainly
by President Bush?
fraudulently given to us, Steve. I mean, every single point. But I wrote this before I wrote it at the time. I looked at the group, the neoconservatives who are around Secretary Rumsfeld and around Vice President Cheney, all these people who have been pushing for a war in Iraq. It's in their writings, it's in their paper trail since the 1980s at least. And not a war in Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction or September 11th, because that hadn't happened yet, but to reconfigure the Middle East. And so, yeah, I watched this all along. I said there was no connection between al-Qaeda and Saddam. They hated each other, actually. Saddam was a heretic, too. He was a secular Ba'athist. I mean, historically, we know that, obviously know this. Weapons of mass destruction, I disagree with Christopher on that. I don't think I thought there were, but I don't think there are now. To overthrow a tyrant, well, we're going to go into Burma, we're going to go into Turkmenistan. No, every single reason they gave for this war, and we have young American men and women dying there, and we have our nation on a very different positioning in the world, where people used to love us as an example, they now hate us as a self-described empire. So yeah, fraudulent, I think, is a kind word.
What would be harsher? What adjective would you use?
Oh, I think it was deliberate misconceiving of the American people. I think it was very deliberate. I don't think it was accidental or they didn't know this or that.
When the president went to the United Nations first to discuss Iraq, he mentioned human rights and genocide, and he mentioned terrorism as well as weapons of mass destruction. He was basically told by the UN, we'll only discuss on one part of this agenda, right? We'll only do weapons. So that in a way conditioned the way, which I say at the end of my article, which you kindly referred to here, and in my book, which I hope you'll have time to wave at some point. It's called A Long, Short War. But there is a distortion, certainly in the way the war was sold. It came down entirely to a matter of the weaponry, a legalism, a way of trying to legalize it internationally. But I'm perfectly happy to say that, like the neoconservatives, I was looking for a way of getting rid of Saddam. I don't think there's anything dishonest in that at all. And in the arguments that were put forward for his removal, there are four ways in which you could say the sovereignty of Iraq had been already compromised. One, tendency, strong one, to invade its neighbors. Two, fooling around with the non-proliferation treaty, without doubt. Iraq never was in compliance with any of those UN resolutions. Okay, refused to come into compliance with very important resolutions on a very important question, and never gave any account of what it had done with the weapons it had disclosed its possession of. I think you're quite wrong in saying there's no connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda members are being found in Iraq as we speak. This relationship did not begin yesterday between them and Saddam Hussein, and it's not true, at all true, that Saddam Hussein was a secularist. For at least the last 10 years, he posed as a Muslim leader. He put verses of the Quran on the Iraqi flag. He built mosques in his own name. And he was in bed with the Hamas and Islamic Jihad forces in Palestine, betraying the PLO and going for the Islamic side. Many more connections between him and that are going to come out. And then finally, he violated the Genocide Convention. And by the way, those who've signed the Genocide Convention are obliged to act on the discovery of genocide without further ado. There's no need for another resolution. You're supposed to act at once, both to prevent and to punish it. In other words, those four things, there's an embarrassment of reasons to get rid of Saddam Hussein. That they picked this legalized, rather pedantic matter of weapons of mass destruction is not terrible and is not deceptive, because Iraq didn't just have these weapons in its possession, but had employed them against their own civilians and against neighboring countries. So it seems to me quite right to have said, we will make the worst assumption about Saddam Hussein. We will assume the worst of him. We will operate on the presumption of guilt. I think any other assumption would have been highly irresponsible, and I wouldn't have wanted in office, either in Washington or in London, a government that, like the predecessors, had said, well, let's give Saddam Hussein another chance. I thought it was absolutely wrong to have done that for so long. The extraordinary thing really is, if you look back at the whole record, is not with what a precipitate means and arguments the British and Americans finally got rid of Saddam Hussein. It's how long they endured him, how long they put up with him, how long they found excuses for him, how long they postponed what was an inevitable reckoning.
As a parallel to the question of if it fails, Christopher Hitchens concludes in Vanity Fair by saying, so dare to repeat, in spite of everything, the breathless question, what if it works?
What if it works?
Let's get to your phone calls. Long Island, New York. We'll come back to you, Georgie and Geyer. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling because, number one, I agree that Mr. Saddam Hussein is an evil man, and everything that Mr. Hitchens just said is correct. Why did Donald Rumsfeld shake hands with him in Baghdad in the 80s when he was using the mustard gas against the Iranians? That wasn't even my point for calling. My point for calling is it true, because you've been in Baghdad, in Iraq, that the fundamentalists are now a threat to the secular nature of the country? A woman from Montana called in the beginning of the program saying that we have liberated the Iraqi women. Well, is it not true that the Iraqi women were the most liberated in all of the Arab countries? They went to school, they became professors, they did not wear veils, but now they're being kidnapped, they stay home. This is what I've been reading in the papers and on the website.
Okay, thanks, caller. The first point about the picture with Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, well, that was, I think, understandable, because that was during the 80s. The threat then was perceived, and it was, from the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was spread the first, people forget that was the big first attempt to spread Islamic fundamentalism all over the Arab world and the Muslim world, and he certainly intended to, and he tried to. The war started with Iraq, and Rumsfeld was there as the American representative. We had lots of communications, lots of connections. We've supplied them with all kinds of intelligence that helped them fight the Iranians and so on. Well, you can say cynically, times change, but as a matter of fact, they do change, and interest changes. As to the question of the women, that's a very good question. I've been in Iraq 7 times since between 1973 and 1990, and I've talked to the women in the movement. I've been all over the country, and yes, they were they were secularized. You would seldom in Baghdad, maybe, as I would say, a tenth in those years, people of the women would be wearing veils. They did not. They were westernized. There was a very vibrant women's movement. And when a country goes into the chaos that they have today, and the Ba'ath Party, which was, despite what Christopher says, the Ba'ath Party was originally a secular movement.
I didn't deny that. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't give another impression.
His whole point. And women were a very important part of it. Today, in chaos, there are rapes, there are murders, the women are afraid to go out. It's not surprising. And you do have, people are worried about a Shia not conspiracy so much, but that there would be an Iranian-type Shiism, fundamentalist government. I don't think that's going to happen. The Shias in Iraq are very, very different people. And they fought on the Iraqi side in the war with Iran. I mean, it's a very complex country, and those would be my answers to those.
Georgie and Geyer, syndicated by the LA Times, and is in how many newspapers around the country?
About 120.
Next call is Edina, Minnesota. Good morning.
Good morning. It's Edina.
Edina, I'm sorry. Good morning.
That's all right. I had a couple questions for Christopher Hitchens. My questions have to do with the principles of Reconstruction in Iraq: individual freedom, economic freedom, and lastly, political freedom. Those institutions. Firstly, about the status of an Iraq constitution, the rule of law, economic freedom, and then lastly, I would assume most people seem to be saying that democracy will be the last piece, or free and open elections. The second area has to do with hasn't really been a very good comparison done between Europe, Germany after World War II. For example, in France, there was around 35,000 French reprisal murders of the Vichy French that was said to going to be happen in Iraq, that we would have a lot of reprisals. Also, to the institutions of the rule of law, economic freedom, these type of things took place over 6 to 14 months. We have some of those things happening in Iraq in 4 months, 3 to 4 months. For example, I know they're coming out with a new currency within the next month or two, and that created economic growth in World War I, World War II, in Germany and in Russia.
Caller, you have a lot there. Let me give Mr. Hitchens a chance to respond. Thank you.
And if I also want to say something about the previous questioner as well, because I think some of what she addressed was to me. Remember that any woman under the regime of Saddam Hussein at any minute could be arrested for no reason and handed over to a group of rapists and torturers, and that happened to thousands and thousands and thousands of Iraqi women. That's not happening anymore. Important point. As to the Rumsfeld handshake and the rest of it, it's true, of course, that there was a time when the United States preferred Iraqi defense to Iranian victory, but I'm afraid to say that this policy of indulging Saddam Hussein followed the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and the United States was still supplying him with a lot of very important material at the time when he was conducting his campaign of genocide in Kurdistan and didn't have the excuse of fending off the Ayatollah. So we have to face the fact that one reason, indeed, why I'm so much in favor of this policy is that it's so much better than seeing American officials groveling to Saddam Hussein, which is what used to happen. By October, there will be a new currency in Iraq, and that'll be a huge relief to everybody because the face of Saddam Hussein will no longer be on the money. I think it's psychologically important as well as commercially important. The critical thing is going to be getting the oil back on stream. People say it was a war for oil. There's one sense in which that's obviously true. Until recently, nobody knew how much oil Iraq was pumping or selling or at what price or where the money was going. We have a rough idea in each case. It was being run by a crime family, in other words. But Iraq probably has more oil than Saudi Arabia in its reserves. And maybe that oil is of higher quality, so it's potentially a fantastically wealthy country. And there are various schemes here. One of them is to give what's done, I believe, in Alaska, give everyone a kind of share. Every citizen gets a dividend from the oil industry. That would obviously be a wonderful thing for the Iraqis, and it would indicate that there really had been a change of regime. Others say that might have to wait because we really are going to need that money for reconstruction. It would of course, be nice to make people feel a bit wealthier, but there are also unbelievable infrastructure problems from a regime that had bankrupted and beggared the place, and a lot of things to be rebuilt. But most of all, you see, what's so great is to be able to be having this discussion and to be able to turn on the TV in Baghdad and to see recognizable Iraqis who represent real social and political forces and are not members of a sadistic mafia discussing these important questions.
That was it?
Yeah, until you pipe C-SPAN into Iraq, it is.
This from a viewer in Ohio. Shouldn't the Iraqis have a right to vote on whether they want to give their wealth to corporations? Georgie and Geyer?
Well, I was in Sarajevo when that was announced last week, and my cynical first thought was, well, we can't govern Iraq, we're going to sell it. And I must say, I talked to some diplomats there who'd been in Iraq, Western diplomats, And they were there for various Western governments, and they were rather startled by this too, and they didn't approve of it, because what it would look like to the Iraqis is that we are selling the country. And you know, you can bring in all kinds of Western other companies, industries, and make it into a country that is owned by foreigners. Now, anyone who knows anything about Middle Eastern history, Steve, knows that this is not going to fly. I mean, the whole history of the Middle East in the 20th century was one of anti-colonialism, of getting the foreigners out, of coming out of the Ottoman Empire, of going through all these experiments, none of them very successful, but they were their experiments. And this is where I say, hey, we're getting into something very, very dangerous. Peoples, and particularly the Iraqis above all, will fight the occupier and the colonialist long after they've stopped fighting Saddam Hussein.
Our next caller watching us on the BBC Parliamentary Channel, which simulcasts this program on Sundays, Cambridge, England. Go ahead.
Hello there. Thank you for letting me on. My point I'd like to make is, first of all, it seems to be in America that for humanitarian reasons in wars, it always seems to be the Democrats who seem to be in power when them cases are taken up. And whenever there's a war involving the Republicans, it always seems to be for a different ideological reason. And with the second point, with the cases of like people complaining about people, the peace movement and everything, I think a lot of the points, it's people agree with the fact that people like Saddam Hussein and that should be removed, but it's the hypocrisy in America through the fact that America in itself has probably got the most dictators which have been in regimes living in America in freedom, in luxury.
Caller, let me ask you specifically about what happened yesterday. About 20,000 people in and around Trafalgar Square in London, about 3,000 in Paris, and other protests elsewhere in Europe. Agree or disagree with that sentiment?
They're not trying to put the right, I don't think they're trying to put the right message across now.
What message should they put out?
The job in Iraq's got to be done, and basically America fought for this and wanted it, and they've got to pay the majority for it.
Christopher Hitchens.
Don't understand the question at all, sorry to say.
What's your take on the...
I don't quite understand the gentleman's question. Could he just make it very specific?
I would say next, actually.
Okay. Still with us, caller? You want to elaborate one more time?
What I'm saying is, like, the multilateralist system, they're trying to set up an international criminal court, but everything America is doing is undermining it by their agreements with certain countries. It's American justice for American people, but multilateral justice for everyone else.
Bottom line, do you agree or disagree with our role in Iraq? Did we do the right thing or the wrong thing?
It's hard to say. It's right in some ways, but wrong in others.
Okay, thank you. Christopher Hitchens, this is an email from Oxnard, California. Has nothing to do with the caller just asked about. Please ask Mr. Hitchens what he thinks of Al Franken's new book, and is he glad he's not mentioned in it?
Gosh, again, I'm really sorry to be stuck with nothing to say again, but I didn't know Al Franken had got any one.
He does have.
And I wouldn't. I mean, I do sometimes pick up books in stores which I think I might be, and I look quickly at the index, and somewhere it's always between Hitler and Hitchcock. Is where my name always comes.
Who is Al Franken? I live in Sarajevo, this of the world.
Well, Al Franken will be featured tonight on Road to the White House.
Al Franken is the comic wing of the Democratic National Committee.
Yeah.
The comic wing.
Yeah, of the DNC.
Well, this is a segue.
He's a complete hacker. I think he campaigned for Hillary Clinton. You know, he can be funny. He used to be on Saturday Night Live, that kind of thing. Wrote a book against Limbaugh, I remember.
And his new book is on Fox.
No, but talking of books, that's much more like
A Long Short War,
yes.
The Postponed Liberation of Iraq by Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah, I think
this photograph taken when?
That is April the 9th, which is the new Iraq National Day.
Chris, was that a picture of you pulling the Saddam statue?
No, I'm out of the frame. I had just left Iraq, actually, when that happened. That is the Fardous Square, Paradise Square in Baghdad at the moment when the dictator fell off the podium. And that's the 9th of April, which will be, the Iraqi Governing Council has proposed should be the new national day.
Speaking of photographs, this is from April 11th, and a vehicle driving underneath the Victory Arch modeled after Saddam Hussein's own arm. How large is that? Were you there personally?
Yeah, that arm is, let's see, the two arms together, you can't see them both, which are just almost as tall as the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, if you can visualize that. And they were modeled from Saddam's own forearms. And underneath them is a huge basket, a metal basket, full of the helmets of dead Iranian soldiers. Every helmet has a bullet hole in it. It's like seeing a pile of skulls. It's an absolutely barbaric monument that Saddam built to himself. Well, as almost everything in Baghdad was named for or after him. And now it's going to be the site of the Museum of the Iraqi and Kurdish Holocaust, run by a friend of mine named Kenan Makia, himself a very brilliant architect who wrote a book about this monument and who is...
And you've written about him in the past.
Yeah, he's a wonderful guy, and he has the institutional memory also of the mass murder in Kurdistan and of the Marsh Arabs and elsewhere. And so there's going to be a library and museum commemorating the atrocities of the past regime.
And Georgie and Geyer, you are now on your 8th or 9th book?
9th, actually, Steve.
And the new one is?
The new book is on the royal and sacred cats of the world. There were all these cultures, Egypt, Burma, Siam, Japan, made cats into royal and sacred creatures. You probably don't know that.
I did not know that. Did you know that, Christopher Hitchens?
I did, as a matter of fact, I know that, and I would far rather be writing about cats than about...
And it's called, and we were talking
politics.
beforehand
I love
that both of us are writing books on things totally different than geopolitics, and we're so relieved. And the book is called Raining Cats.
What made you write about the cats?
I was just telling back to tell us we came. The Prophet Muhammad is said to have cut the sleeve
Yes.
of his robe rather than waken a cat that had fallen asleep on his arm.
He did.
And there are all innumerable cases in the past of ruling factions or families making cats sort of part of the act. Very intelligent too, I think.
Do you own
the Egyptians
cats?
to do that.
I have one cat. Yeah, one cat.
Back to your
When you
phone
think of the
calls.
other gods people have worshipped, I mean, cats much better than,
That's right.
Better than what?
well, say than Allah or
Well, they're beautiful.
you know, considering Jesus Christ to be some, I mean, the nonsensical beliefs that people have of that sort. Far better to say, let's worship a cat.
I asked the
You know
director.
what you're getting, and the rule will not be too exorbitant, and you won't be asked to obey impossible or irrational commandments.
Seattle,
You just have to give up a
Washington.
bit of your
You're
autonomy.
next. Go
Going
ahead.
on too much.
Go ahead, Seattle.
Good morning.
Are you a cat lover too, caller?
Yes, when I was a child. Okay, my question is for Christopher Hitchens. Christopher, what is your opinion of this presidency since when it came to picking a person to run the September 11th commission, they picked Henry Kissinger.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that's someone you have offered referring to as the bastard. Now, there's no doubt that Saddam Hussein was an evil person, but does it at all bother you that this liberation of Iraq came under this president's watch? So,
Thank you.
I was very opposed to having Henry Kissinger appointed to that commission, and I more or less predicted in the protest article I wrote about it that he wouldn't make it, however, to confirmation, because in order to chair the commission, he'd have to open the books of Kissinger Associates, his consulting firm. And I didn't think he would be willing to undergo that kind of inspection of it. Kissinger Associates is an outfit that basically introduces despots to the corporations who like them. It's one of Kissinger's many sordid careers. And I knew that if he had to have disclosure, he wouldn't be able to submit to it. So I was right about that. He gave up. So also gave people an opportunity, including a number of Republicans, to see what kind of guy he really is. I mean, having said, yes, I accept this great honor of finding out what happened to our 3,000 missing and murdered fellow citizens, he said, well, actually, it's not such a great honor if it compromises my business posture. Gives you a rough idea of the quality of the guy, let's say. Mr. Paul Bremer, who I recently interviewed in Baghdad, he's in my piece, was a member of Kissinger Associates too, I have to say, and that gives me a twinge also. But finally, since you pressed me on the question, this administration actually acted upon the resolutions that had already been passed and the stands that had already been taken about Iraq, and I'm glad that they did.
Christopher Hitchens writes in the October edition of Vanity Fair, lest there be no confusion, this is George Clooney on the cover, not Christopher Hitchens. Next is a call from Cumberland, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. My question is for Georgie and Geyer. I thoroughly disagree with her article on Kosovo, and I'd like to educate her a bit. I'd like to point out that if Kosovo ever gains independence, we will be having a greater Albania. It will destabilize Macedonia. It will destabilize some of the Serbian provinces. The only way to deal with Kosovo is let the Serbs have it back and let the Serbs take control. We fought the wrong war over Kosovo because all we did was support terrorism in the form of the KLA, and it will be the KLA that will dominate that region. And I'd like her to comment on that.
Thank you.
Well, I believe the lady must be a Serb because they are the only group of people.
Why not? I mean, there'd be no shame in that, surely.
No, but to put forward that position, Kosovo was a region of Yugoslavia, and I was there in 1992 when it was under the Serb police, and I've been in a lot of nasty places, Vietnam, Salvador, Iraq, and during the Iraq-Iran War, et cetera, and I have never seen such an oppressive society as the one that the Serbs ruled there. The Kosovars had been taken out of the universities, the schools were closed, the health was closed, the health services were closed, the banks were closed. They were trying to make them into a non-existent people. So I applauded our war there in 1999. I think it was one of the most virtuous and noble things we have done, and rather uncomplicated by that time after waiting much too long. As to a greater Albania, I mean, there is nobody that believes in a greater Albania. Kosovars are far more advanced than the Albanians. If anything, they would be a very good example and a good reference point in that area. It's not decided yet. I think it could still go a lot of ways. But morally, I mean, to talk about the Serbs in Kosovo as some kind of desirable period of time or people it's about the same as talking about Saddam Hussein as a useful leader.
And actually, even if the lady was right about the Greater Albania threat and the KLA, and there are some nasty people who sort of take an irredentist view of it. Just as a practical matter, what I could say from visiting Kosovo myself not long ago, there's no possibility of it going back to Serbian rule. I mean, it just is a physical impossibility. You'd have to kill everyone in Kosovo to make Serbian rule possible there.
But at the same time, nobody, the UN, the United States, nobody is going to take the really dramatic step that steps that are needed to give it independence. And so it's tied up in all kinds of knots right now.
Oceano, California. For Christopher Hitchens and Georgie and Geyer, you're next.
Yeah, good morning. I was wondering about the C-SPAN's institutional memory. I remember in late 89, early 90, there was a vote on the $4 billion, excuse me, I'm a little nervous, I've never called.
I'm getting nervous too because I don't know what you're going to ask us, so go ahead.
There's a $4 billion loan, sort of no interest, to Iraq, and this is...
Before the war.
Oh, yeah. This is in the Bush administration, the first one, and it was, the liberal Democrats got up and they showed the pictures of, all these dead Iraqis that have been, the Kurds that have been gassed.
Mm-hmm.
The Republicans didn't care at all. It's business, They were, Iraqis killing Iranians, Iranians killing Iraqis. It's business. We don't care as long as we can get in there and make a deal.
Georgie and Geyer?
Yeah, that happened. I mean, we gave them all kinds of stuff. We gave them intelligence during the Iran-Iraq war. We gave the Iraqis intelligence that our satellites that showed where the Iranians were. We did all kinds of stuff. And our companies have, and the Russian companies have, and the French in particular. It's a rich country, and that worries me. It worries me now, because when they said last week 100% of Iraq can be sold to foreign companies outside of mineral and extractive industries, I got a real pain in my stomach, because you can see a lot of problems coming with that. I don't know what to say to the gentleman, but it's a problem.
And the previous caller, too, were talking about the connection between Secretary Rumsfeld, who was not in the government at the time when he met with Saddam Hussein.
Right.
The alliance of convenience, the Shah in the 1960s and 70s, was that what Saddam was as he was going after Iran in
It was
the 80s?
definitely an alliance of convenience at that time. And I'm not a purist. I mean, those things...
Are we paying a price for that today?
We pay a price for all these things. But, you know, supporting the Shah was the modernizer. The Shah was the one who was going to bring his country into the 21st century. So we don't... It's not that you do everything wrong. It's that the world goes on in its own way, and peoples go on in their own way.
I'd like to just add, I mean, it's true, and I don't know if the gentleman was still tuned in when we were talking to the previous caller. I mean, I could multiply examples of previous cynicism and complicity, but I think it deserves to be said that cynical though some of this has been, it's not in the same class for cynicism as, let's say, the policy of France towards Iraq, or Monsieur Chirac and the supposed anti-warriors. Mr. Chirac, for example, built, Saddam Hussein, a nuclear reactor, knowing what he wanted it for. And French business interests were very much involved in Iraq, as were Russian ones, and French and Russian businesses were owed a great deal of money. It was stolen from the Iraqi people by Saddam Hussein. They had an interest in keeping him going for that reason. So if this argument is going to tell, this argument about cynicism and collusion and exploitation, it has to be said to tell against those who were against the war as well.
Richard Holbrooke is quoted in a New York Times piece this morning. I don't have it in front of me, but he basically says the relationship between the U.S. and France is not as bad as it may appear by some.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Next call.
I think a confrontation with Mr. Chirac is absolutely essential. French unilateralism and French colonialism are a real threat to international order, and I think it's high time there was a confrontation with him.
I'll try to find it. We'll go to Ocala, Florida. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to make a basic fundamental observation of my 53 years of life. I looked up in the dictionary the word intellectual. It states reasoning versus emotional. And I've read both Mr. Hitchens and the lady's columns, and I do see a great difference between the two. The lady seems to be always very emotional. Mr. Hitchens seems to be reasoning quite a bit more. And I think it's a basic difference between the conservative and the liberal party. And for the liberal party to stand on any moral ground is beyond me when people they support are basically and generally less moral. And I would like your comment on my statement. Thank you very much.
Well, do you consider me the liberal or the conservative?
Caller?
Yes, that wasn't clear to me either.
Yeah, do you consider me the liberal or the conservative?
He hung up.
Because for years I've been considered a conservative. Now I'm getting all these emails saying, but I'm a middle ground person. Now I'm getting all these emails saying, you darned or more lefty and things like that. It's a very hard time for clarity.
I get the same in reverse.
I bet you do.
People say I'm now a neocon. I mean, which on Iraq I am. So fair enough. I'm glad it's nice when people notice.
This is from the New York Times.
I don't think one's emotions are there completely to be distrusted. Some of our emotions prompt us intellectually in the right way. But actually, I don't know what dictionary the gentleman was using to look this up.
I don't know either.
As far as I know, and I've always hoped that this is true, the term intellectual originates as a term of abuse, as of someone being unsound and unreliable and possibly treacherous. I think it originates as a word to sneer at the supporters of Captain Dreyfus in France during the frame of Dreyfus. The patriots and the Catholics and the militarists who wanted to keep the frame up going described those who believed in the justice for a single individual as mere intellectuals, with no concept of the national interest of the higher. I think you'll find that that's true, and I hope the association with subversion, therefore, stays in the definition.
Elaine Chilino writes the column for this morning's New York Times. This is not as serious as people think. That's the quote from Richard Holbrooke I referred to earlier. He served as the UN ambassador and also as the U.S. ambassador to Germany. None of us in the loyal opposition understand why the Bush administration hasn't co-opted Chirac and said, you want Iraqi sovereignty? So do we. Our differences are only timing and tactical. Again, this is not as serious as people think. Next call is from Martin, Tennessee. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. My question goes to Mr. Hitchens. and it's basically Mr. Hitchens makes a strong argument for going to war with Iraq on the basis that Iraq has indeed violated so many UN resolutions. And my question is, well, what about the status of the State of Israel? How many resolutions has the State of Israel been in violation of over so many years? What about its possession of nuclear arms and so on? What would be his position on something like that?
There are two regional allies of the United States in the Middle East, Turkey and Israel, which between them have amassed a pile of resolutions of condemnation from the UN that would be the equal of the resolutions on Iraq. You're quite right. Turkey for the occupation of northern Cyprus and the colonization and settlement, as well as annexation of the sovereign territory of another state, and Israel for its attempt to incorporate the West Bank into a greater Israel. I think it's absolutely time that one of several things at least happen. Either I'm not trying to be funny, the United States Supreme Court should, I think, rule that American aid may not be spent on the West Bank of the Jordan River because it's an establishment of religion. American money can't be used for settlements that have as their motive a messianic redemption and the attempt to bring on Armageddon. That's what these settlers are trying to do. I think they should be stopped. I don't think a single dime of American money should go for that, and I think that American force would be justifiably employed in removing them if the Israeli government won't comply with the resolutions.
From U.S. News and World Report, Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton told U.S. News that I was struck by reading that after the first Gulf War, Dick Cheney said he would send a thank you note to Ronald Reagan. You always fight wars with the military you inherited, she said. I don't think he's done that to my husband. I would be happy to deliver it personally if he would write it. Next call is from Spring Hill, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a question for Mr. Hitchens. Don't you agree, sir, that $87 billion is really cheap considering the limited loss of life that we've experienced? And isn't that something that the Republicans should absolutely stand upon? Thank you.
Well, if I understand it correctly, I mean, 87 billion is a large chunk of change, however much of a bargain it might turn out to be. I think it could be broken out a bit, this figure, and it is being. It needs to be made a bit more transparent what the money is for and how it's to be earmarked and spent. But I personally think that, I don't know if you were watching earlier when Dr. Bahram Salih was on the show, the Prime Minister of Kurdistan in northern Iraq, but it ought to be brought up now, I think, the fact that the United Nations Oil for Food program, which turned out to be an oil for palaces program and generally a very maladministered, scandalous abuse of the sanction system, nonetheless, it did produce a great deal of money which belongs to the Iraqi people, now being held in escrow, some of it in French banks. I think it should be demanded by public opinion and raised in Congress that this money too be released for the reconstruction of Iraq, because that's money the Iraqis have already parted with and should be being ploughed back into their country. It was supposed to have been spent already on the reconstruction of Kurdistan and hasn't been. And there are billions of unspent dollars, in other words, that are being maladministered or sequestered by the United Nations. And it's time that this argument be brought into play as well if we're going to have to listen to lectures from people like Mr. Chirac about the sovereignty of Iran.
Georgie and Geyer, this email, how would the situation in the Mideast today be different if Ariel Sharon had not walked through that Muslim holy place in Jerusalem in the fall of the year 2000?
There's just no question in my mind, Steve, and to the viewer, that walk with 3,000 policemen and military through the Temple Mount in September of 2001 was the act that started the Intifada. I was talking in Europe the other day with Yossi Beilin, the marvelous former deputy foreign minister of Israel and one of the most respected Israelis, and he said the Intifada was already planned. Mahmoud Barghouti, one of the Palestinian leaders who's more respected, had come to him the spring before and said, we have to go to the streets because the extremists are taking over from us. He said, but the timing was Sharon's. Sharon was the one that set it off. And if you look at Sharon's whole life, this is what he does. You know, I have a very intelligent cat, but my cat doesn't bark. He meows. And Sharon does what he does. He's a very violent man. He's a man of chaos. And he knows how to set off the Palestinians who are very chaotic and undisciplined in their own way and very easy to manipulate. And so, yes, that was, you know, Yossi Beilin said to me just the other day, and I wrote it in my column, he said the timing was everything because at that moment they had only a few months to the election and they were still negotiating, and this destroyed all possibility of negotiation.
Well, that's what I wanted to add, which is the scandalous thing about what Sharon did is he did all that to try and undermine Bibi Netanyahu.
Yeah.
In other words, this whole disaster is the result of a factional squabble between two right-wing Israelis for advantage. This is a nightmarish realization. However, I mean, it agreed that it was a sordid provocation, and from someone who I also agree with you is a war criminal, and who was, by the Kahan Commission, it was recommended into Sabra Shatila, when they finished with the investigation, that he never be invited even to serve in any Israeli government again, let alone be prime minister. People should remember that. But it doesn't mean the Palestinians had to act as if the provocation forced them to commit suicide.
They were all. That's why I put the part about
I think
Barghouti.
there seems to be no doubt about it. They were very, very ill-advised to take this.
I'm not defending their rationality. That's not the question. But Israel is the dominant power. Israel is the occupying power.
Well, more to the point that they didn't have a leader who would say. They didn't have a leader who felt he could say, "Listen, this is not." This is a leader who followed a mob for a short time and plunged everyone into this misery.
Beilin said that they met. He was in the government then, the Barak government, and he said they had to give Sharon permission. And he said we thought about it, we worried about it, we went over and over and over it. And we finally did it because we said we can't not allow an Israeli leader to walk through the Temple Mount with, he said 3,000. I always had heard 1,000, but he was there. And he said it was totally wrong that we gave that permission. Now we can see because it was Sharon took over the whole timing at that point.
Our conversation with Georgie Geyer, who is out with her latest book called Raining Cats?
Raining Cats, not quite yet, but it will be.
And Christopher Hitchens, when's that coming out?
Next year.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought it was more recent. And Christopher Hitchens, who has a new book, which we do have here, called A Long Short War, The Postponed Liberation of Iraq, and also a piece in Vanity Fair. Our next call, Vegasville, California. Good morning.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to say that Georgie Geyer does give a fair and balanced history. And that is what I'm mainly calling about. I'm very concerned about how the rhetoric has gotten so deep that they changed the history of what happened in Iraq. And I happen to be of the age where I remember exactly our part in the Iran War and that the Iraqis lost 1 million citizens. Also in the Gulf War, and by the way, I had voted for Senior Bush. In the Gulf War, they had the Kurds back them, and what would we do in our country if the Patriots did war against our U.S.?
Okay, I'll stop you there. Thank you, caller.
I appreciate the caller's comments very much because I think we're losing track of one thing that's very important here, which were the principles and the reasons for going to war, all of which have been shown to be untrue. Now, I was in Vietnam 4 times at the end of the 60s and the early 70s. It took us 20 years to come out of the fact of all the lies that went into Vietnam. And I see that happening again, and I don't believe you can go move on an unprincipled manner in this country because this is going to come out and out and out and out for years, just like it did for Vietnam. And are we going to have 20 years now to get out of Iraq?
The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was imagine what was the crux of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that was just one thing.
Was not just inventing a provocation and pretending there'd been a salvo fired at a U.S. ship when there hadn't been. The point is, it would have been misconceived if there had been a Vietnamese attack on the ship. It was the whole idea the United States could arbitrate the future of Vietnam or could or should inherit the French colonial role there was wrong to begin with. So there couldn't, in other words, have been a good or truthful argument. I don't think that's the case in Iraq. I think the fact is that a long engagement with Saddam Hussein's government had demonstrated repeatedly that anything short of regime change was a very dangerous policy.
Christopher, a quick follow-up from an email that says, from David Gallagher, did Kissinger really once say that oil is far too important to leave to the Arabs?
Not as far as I know. No, I can't say that I know that he said that. It does sound a bit like his rather heavy, gross sense of humor, I will say.
Mansfield, Connecticut, good morning. Go ahead, Mansfield.
Hi there. I'd like to talk to Christopher Hitchens about a couple of things. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your support in Iraq. I've not read your book on Kissinger, but I've read the latest book on Iraq. I wonder, though, how you reconcile some of your views on Kissinger and some of the things that, how he's perceived in Vietnam, where I spent quite a bit of time in the 1990s. Kissinger, Nixon, McNamara, and these people are kind of like national heroes there. The most hated thing is the government, followed by the Communist Party, and the most ridiculed figure in Vietnamese history is Ho Chi Minh. I often find people in the media, perhaps they're too famous to find the truth in places like that, and if you can find someone you really trust and send them in for a few years who are not known, and they'll come back and tell you the truth, or if you want to call me back off the air and we can talk about it.
Christopher Hitchens, your response.
Well, I haven't been in Indochina, I have to confess. I would still be surprised to find that Henry Kissinger was a street hero in Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos after what he did there. I can't obviously tell you that you didn't hear or see what you say you did, but I also feel that probably if it was true, someone else would have told me by now, and it's the first time I've ever heard that.
Final point for each of you. This is from Tom Friedman this morning. The New York Times, the collective response from Mr. Bush's visit to the UN this past week, quote, "You talking to us? This is your war, pal. We told you before about Iraq. You break it alone, you own it alone. Well, you broke it. Now you own it. We've got you over a barrel because you and your taxpayers have no choice but to see this through. So why should we pay?"
Tom is absolutely right. This is exactly the outcome of people of smart-ass diplomacy, and that's what we've been waging.
Smart-ass diplomacy.
Yeah, insulting the whole world. We'll go it alone. We don't need any of you. Now suddenly we do know them. The discourtesy of this man, the president, who used to be so courteous. It's a very strange transformation.
I think the president's much too polite to these people myself. And look at if you want to talk about criminal irresponsibility, what about people saying, okay, we'll watch and see how you go in Iraq. We'll act as if it doesn't matter to us at all, as if we have as if we had no share in what happened to the place. This from people who built Saddam Hussein a nuclear reactor in the past. They say, well, you know, we'll watch you as if we were neutral, as if it didn't matter to us, and we reserve the right to criticize, of course, but we don't think we have it. Outrageous, absolutely outrageous, and I think that the president should be a great deal more forthright about this than he is. Mr. Chirac would be in jail if he wasn't president of France. He had to run in order to keep his immunity from prosecution for fantastic corruption. Mainly, he and his party, incidentally, this corruption took the form of taking bribes from foreign governments. I would be very, very surprised if Saddam Hussein wasn't one of those who kicked in to these coffers, and I think this would be well within the rights of the United States government to mention this fact, that we are dealing, in the case of the French regime, with a rogue state.
Christopher Hitchens, pick up Vanity Fair with his latest article, also his new book, A Long Short War, and Georgie Geyer, her new book on cats, coming out next year. She is a syndicated columnist in well over 100 newspapers around the country. Thank you both for joining us.
Pleasure.
Come back again. Joseph Wilson will be joining us tomorrow morning on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, along with Eileen Harrington, who will be here to talk about the Do Not Call list, and Jim Puzangara, who is with the San Jose Mercury News on Proposition 54. Thanks for joining us on this Sunday. Have a great weekend.
This is C-SPAN, brought to you as a public service by the nation's cable industry.